Chapter 1. The Weight of Velvet Chains. Silk rubbed against Aelira's skin like 1,000 cold, judgmental fingers. She stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror, her breath hitching as the handmaidens tightened the corset of her ceremonial gown. It was a masterpiece of lace and silver thread, designed to signal purity and submission to the Blood Moon Pack. For years, her elders had whispered that her only value lay in this moment, the day she would secure their borders by becoming the Alpha's mate. Because she had been groomed for duty since her first shift, every step felt like a rehearsed dance on a razor's edge. Her reflection looked like a stranger, a porcelain doll with hollow eyes and a heart that drummed a frantic, uneven rhythm against her ribs. Outside the stone chamber, the howling of the pack reached a deafening crescendo. It wasn't a sound of joy. It was a hungry, predatory demand for the ritual to begin. Aelira gripped the edge of the vanity, her knuckles turning the color of bleached bone. She wondered if the Alpha, Marcus, felt this same suffocating pressure, or if he merely saw her as a necessary piece of furniture for his throne room. A sudden chill swept through the room, making the candle flames dance and sputter. In the corner of the mirror, she caught a glimpse of an older woman, her aunt, whose smile didn't reach her eyes. The woman smoothed a stray hair from Aelira's forehead, her touch lacking any warmth of kinship. "You look perfect, child," the woman murmured, though her voice carried the weight of a threat. "Do not forget that the safety of our entire lineage rests on your ability to please him tonight." Aelira nodded, her throat too tight to swallow. Why did love always feel like a debt she hadn't finished paying? She stepped toward the heavy oak doors, the weight of the silver-beaded train dragging behind her like a ball and chain. As she moved through the corridor, the scent of pine and damp earth grew stronger, signaling their proximity to the sacred clearing. She passed beneath the arched stone gate, where the pack members stood in silent, watchful rows. Their eyes weren't filled with admiration, but with a cold, analytical hunger. They were assessing her worth, weighing her scent against the legends of the Alphas of old. Suddenly, a conversation drifted from behind a heavy tapestry, freezing the blood in her veins. Two high-ranking warriors were leaning against the stone wall, their voices low but carrying clearly in the crisp night air. "He's only doing it to satisfy the council," one whispered, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "Marcus never loved her. He's still obsessed with the stray he found in the North Woods." The words hit Aelira like a physical blow to the solar plexus. Her vision blurred for a second, the world tilting on its axis as the foundation of her life cracked. Was everything she had sacrificed, every bit of her own identity, just a placeholder for a shadow? Because she had no other choice, she forced her legs to keep moving, even as her soul screamed to flee into the dark forest. She reached the edge of the clearing where the bonfire roared, the flames licking at the obsidian sky. Marcus stood at the altar, his posture rigid and his eyes fixed on some point far beyond her. He looked powerful, yes, but he also looked entirely absent. Aelira felt the collective gaze of hundreds of wolves pressing in on her, a physical weight that threatened to crush her lungs. She reached the center of the circle, her heart a trapped bird fluttering against the cage of her chest. Just as she moved to take Marcus's hand, she felt a different sensation, a prickle of heat at the base of her neck. It wasn't the heat of the fire, but the intensity of a gaze so sharp it felt like a brand. She turned her head slightly, her eyes scanning the dark periphery of the trees. There, standing partially obscured by the ancient oaks, was a figure draped in shadows. It was Kael. He stood with a detached, lethal grace that made the other warriors look like children playing at war. His eyes were unreadable, deep pools of mystery that seemed to see right through her lace and silver lies. For a heartbeat, the world went silent. The crackle of the fire and the murmurs of the crowd faded into a dull hum. She felt a strange, magnetic pull toward the man in the shadows, a connection that defied every law of her upbringing. It was a dangerous, flickering spark that suggested there was a world beyond duty, a world of darkness and truth. Marcus cleared his throat, a sharp sound that snapped her back to the agonizing reality of her wedding. Chapter 2. The Altar of Silence. The moon hung overhead like a silver executioner's blade, casting a pale, ghostly light over the assembled wolves. Aelira stood beside Marcus, her hand trembling as he gripped her fingers with a strength that bordered on painful. He wasn't holding her as a lover, he was holding her as a prize. The high priest stepped forward, his fur-trimmed robes smelling of ancient musk and sacrificial herbs. He began the incantation, the old tongue vibrating through the ground and into the soles of Aelira's feet. She looked at Marcus, searching for a single flicker of warmth, but his face remained a mask of cold stone. Because she had spent her life believing this was her destiny, the silence between them felt like a death sentence. "We stand before the Great Spirit to witness the union of the blood moon," the priest proclaimed, his voice echoing off the surrounding cliffs. Aelira felt the eyes of the pack boring into her, waiting for the moment of transcendence when their souls would supposedly knit together. Instead, she felt only a growing sense of dread. She glanced back toward the tree line, but Kael was gone, leaving behind an emptiness that felt more substantial than Marcus's presence. The ritual progressed to the vows, the moment where the alpha would publicly claim his mate. Marcus took a deep breath, his chest expanding under his leather tunic. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words seemed to catch in his throat, a hesitation that sent a ripple of murmurs through the crowd. The silence stretched, becoming a living thing that strangled the air out of the clearing. Aelira watched as Marcus's eyes shifted, glancing toward the very warriors she had overheard earlier. His jaw tightened, and a look of pure resentment crossed his features. He wasn't looking at a bride. He was looking at a burden. The humiliation began as a slow burn in Aelira's cheeks, spreading downward until it consumed her entire being. She realized in that agonizing pause that he wasn't going to do it. He was going to break her in front of everyone she had ever known. "I cannot!" Marcus finally hissed, the words cutting through the night like a serrated knife. The crowd gasped, a collective sound of shock that felt like a slap. Aelira stood frozen, her hand still trapped in his as he pulled away with a look of disgust. The rejection was a physical force, a tidal wave that crashed over her and pulled her under. She saw her aunt's face turn into a mask of fury, not for Aelira's pain, but for the lost political leverage. Because the rejection of an alpha was a mark of permanent shame, Aelira knew her life as she knew it ended in that second. She was no longer the chosen daughter, she was a pariah. "I reject you," Marcus said louder, his voice regaining its cold authority. "You are not the one my wolf calls for." He turned his back on her, walking toward the shadows where his true interests lay. Aelira stood alone at the altar, the center of a circle of mockery and pity. The fire seemed to dim, the warmth vanishing to leave her shivering in her expensive, useless gown. She wanted to scream, to run, to vanish into the earth, but her legs refused to move. Then, the heavy silence was broken by the sound of boots crunching on dry leaves. A figure stepped out of the darkness, moving with a steady, purposeful gait that commanded the attention of every wolf in the clearing. It was Kael. He didn't look at Marcus, and he didn't look at the priest. He walked straight toward Aelira, his presence acting like a shield against the biting wind of the pack's judgment. He stopped a few feet away, his dark eyes finally meeting hers. There was no pity in his gaze, only a grim, unwavering intensity. He looked like a man who had walked through hell and found it lacking. The pack watched in stunned silence as the outcast warrior, the man feared for his lethality and his silence, reached out a hand. "Then I will take her," Kael announced, his voice a low rumble that seemed to shake the very foundations of the forest. The declaration was a thunderclap in the stillness. It wasn't a request. It was a claim. Marcus spun around, his face contorting in a mix of shock and rage, but Kael didn't flinch. Aelira looked at the hand extended toward her, a hand scarred by battle and hardened by survival. She had two choices: stay and be trampled by the pack she had failed, or step into the unknown with the most dangerous man she had ever seen. Because her survival instinct drowned out her terror, she reached out and placed her hand in his. The moment their skin touched, a jolt of electricity shot up her arm, a violent, beautiful spark that made her gasp. Chapter 3. The Binding Spark. The touch of Kael's skin against hers felt like a brand of fire, igniting a sensation Aelira didn't know her body was capable of harboring. It wasn't the gentle, manufactured warmth she had expected from Marcus. It was a raw, primal energy that threatened to consume her. Kael's fingers closed around hers with a possessive strength, pulling her away from the altar of her humiliation. The pack erupted into a chaotic roar of protest and confusion, but Kael ignored them all, his focus entirely locked on the woman he had just claimed. Because the world was blurring at the edges, Aelira allowed him to lead her toward the center of the clearing, where the priest stood in paralyzed shock. "The ritual is not finished," Kael barked, his voice silencing the dissenters with the sheer force of his will. "Complete the binding." The high priest stammered, his hands shaking as he raised the ceremonial obsidian dagger. The tradition required a drop of blood from each participant to seal the contract under the moon's gaze. Kael didn't hesitate, holding his palm out for the blade. As the dark metal sliced through his skin, he didn't even blink, his eyes remaining fixed on Aelira. When it was her turn, she felt a strange sense of liberation. The blood that dripped into the silver bowl was the last remnant of her old life, the final payment to the family that had discarded her. As the priest mixed their blood and began the final chant, the atmosphere in the clearing shifted. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with a static tension that made the hair on Aelira's arms stand up. She felt a pulling sensation in the center of her chest, a tether forming that dragged her toward Kael's soul. It was a terrifying, intrusive feeling, as if her very essence was being rewritten in real time. Suddenly, Kael let out a sharp, guttural groan, his grip on her hand tightening until her bones creaked. His eyes went wide, the dark irises bleeding into a molten gold that glowed with an internal light. The bond wasn't just forming, it was exploding. It hit them with the force of a physical collision, a psychic shockwave that threw Aelira's mind into a whirlwind of images and emotions that weren't her own. She saw flashes of gray mountains, felt the sting of winter winds, and tasted the metallic tang of old grief. Kael recoiled as if he had been struck, his other hand flying to his chest as he struggled to breathe. This wasn't the smooth, peaceful transition the stories described. This was a violent collision of two broken things. "Stop it!" Marcus yelled, stepping forward with his claws extended. But he was too late. A blinding flash of silver light erupted from the point where their hands were joined, throwing the nearest onlookers back. Aelira felt her knees buckle, the sheer weight of the connection dragging her down. Kael caught her, his arms wrapping around her with a desperation that terrified her. He was shaking, his breath coming in ragged, tortured gasps. The bond was a living wire between them, humming with a frequency that threatened to shatter her heart. She looked up at him, seeing the agony and the confusion etched into his rugged features. "What have you done?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the ringing in her ears. Kael didn't answer immediately. He looked down at their joined hands, where the light was slowly fading into a faint, pulsing glow beneath their skin. He looked at her then, and for the first time she saw a flicker of genuine fear in his eyes. It was the fear of a man who had built walls for a lifetime, only to see them turn to dust in a single heartbeat. He realized, just as she did, that this wasn't a political arrangement or a simple act of mercy. It was something far more dangerous. "You just changed everything," Kael rasped, his voice thick with a mixture of awe and resentment. He didn't wait for a response. He swept her up into his arms, ignoring the outraged shouts of the alpha and the confused murmurs of the pack. He turned away from the fire, away from the life she had failed to earn, and strode into the deep, unforgiving darkness of the forest. Aelira pressed her face against his shoulder, the scent of leather and storm clouds enveloping her. She was no longer the perfect bride or the useful daughter. She was something unknown, tied to a man who looked at her as if she were a beautiful disaster. As the lights of the village faded behind them, she knew there was no turning back. The story was no longer about belonging. It was about survival. Because she had chosen to live, she had invited a storm into her soul, and Kael was the eye of that storm. She closed her eyes, letting the rhythmic thud of his heart lull her into a dark, uncertain peace. The forest swallowed them whole, leaving the blood moon pack to whisper about the bride who had been rejected by a king only to be claimed by a ghost. Chapter 4. The Fortress of Frost and Iron. The silence of the northern peaks was not peaceful. It was a physical weight that pressed against Aelira's chest as Kael's massive obsidian gates groaned shut behind them. For hours, she had been a passenger in her own life, draped across his saddle like a silk banner from a defeated army. The air here tasted of ancient ice and sharp pine, a bitter contrast to the sweet, suffocating florals of the Blood Moon Valley. Because she had been raised in the warmth of a pampered court, the sudden drop in temperature felt like a personal assault on her skin. She shivered, her fingers clutching the rough wool of the cloak Kael had tossed over her shoulders without a word. "This is the Black Crag," Kael said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to come from the earth itself. He didn't offer a hand as she slid down from the horse, his eyes already scanning the perimeter of the stone courtyard. The fortress was a jagged tooth of granite biting into the gray sky, stripped of any ornament or comfort. It was a place built for war, not for a woman wearing the tattered remains of a wedding gown. Aelira stood on the uneven cobbles, her silver-beaded train dragging through the slush. She felt small, a splash of unnecessary brightness against a world of monochrome shadow. Because she was a private person by nature, the sudden exposure of her status, a rejected bride in a stranger's keep, made her want to fold into herself. "I don't expect you to like it," Kael added, finally turning to look at her. "But you will be safe here." Safety felt like a hollow word when her heart was still echoing with the sound of Marcus's rejection. Aelira watched Kael's back as he began to unburden the horse, his movements efficient and cold. He wasn't acting like a husband, or even a captor. He was acting like a sentry guarding a post he hadn't asked for. She realized then that her presence was a disruption to his solitude, a glitch in the clockwork of his isolated life. The pack members who lingered in the shadows of the courtyard didn't greet her with bows. They watched with bared teeth and eyes full of suspicion. To them, she wasn't a Luna. She was a liability from a rival territory. "Where am I supposed to go?" she asked, her voice cracking in the thin air. Kael gestured toward a narrow stone stairwell that wound upward into the heart of the keep. He didn't lead her there, opting instead to stay with his beast, his jaw set in a line of permanent tension. Aelira climbed the stairs alone, her lungs burning as the altitude clawed at her throat. She found a chamber at the top, a room of cold stone and a single narrow bed covered in heavy furs. There were no tapestries to dampen the wind that whistled through the arrow slits. Because she had been groomed to believe her worth was tied to her comfort and beauty, the austerity of the room felt like a final confirmation of her fall from grace. She sat on the edge of the bed, the silence of the room amplifying the frantic beat of the bond in her chest. It was a dull ache now, a rhythmic thrumming that pulsed in time with Kael's footsteps somewhere far below. It was an intrusive, uninvited tether that reminded her she was no longer her own master. She pulled the furs around her, staring at the door and waiting for the moment he would come to claim what he had bought at the altar. But the hours bled into a deep, freezing night, and the door remained closed. Kael remained a ghost in his own house, leaving her to drown in the quiet of her new, cold reality. Chapter 5. The Language of Teeth. Morning brought no sunlight, only a thick, suffocating fog that erased the horizon and turned the Black Crag into a floating island in the clouds. Aelira descended the stairs with a heavy heart, her silk dress now stained with soot and dampness. She found the main hall, a cavernous space where a long wooden table sat before a hearth that struggled to throw any heat. A group of Kael's warriors, scarred, hulking men and women with eyes like flint, stopped their eating the moment she appeared. The air turned jagged with hostility, a scent of wet fur and aggression that made Aelira's inner wolf crouch in a defensive posture. The Alpha's leftovers have finally woken up, a female warrior sneered, dropping a bone onto a pewter plate with a sharp clatter. The mockery hit Aelira like a physical weight, but she refused to look down. Because she had spent her life being perfect for a role she lost, she had nothing left to protect but her pride. She walked toward the hearth, her chin tilted high even as her hands trembled. The warriors watched her with a predatory curiosity, waiting for the high-born girl to break or beg for mercy. Just as the female warrior stood up to block Aelira's path, the heavy doors at the end of the hall swung open with a violent crash. Kael entered, his leather armor dusted with a fresh layer of frost, and his eyes glowing with a suppressed amber light. He didn't say a word, but the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly from mockery to lethal silence. He walked past his warriors, his presence like a cold front moving through the hall. He stopped directly in front of the woman who had spoken, his height towering over her until she was forced to lean back. The growl that vibrated through his chest was low and sustained, a sound of pure dominance that made the very floorboards hum. "She is under my protection," Kael rasped, the words carrying the weight of a death threat. "If you speak to her again, you will answer to my claws." The warrior dipped her head in a sharp, reluctant submission, her eyes darting to the floor. Kael didn't look back at Aelira. He didn't check to see if she was grateful. He simply took a seat at the head of the table and began to eat in a silence that was more terrifying than the insults had been. Aelira sat at the far end of the table, picking at a piece of coarse bread that tasted like ash in her mouth. She watched him through her lashes, noting the way his hands, the same hands that had claimed her, were steady and scarred. He was a man of violence, yet he had stood between her and the pack's cruelty. "I didn't ask you to do that," Aelira said softly, her voice carrying across the silent hall. Kael paused, his fork hovering midair. He looked at her then, and for a split second, the bond flared between them, a hot needle of awareness that made her breath hitch. He didn't smile. He didn't soften. He simply stared at her with an intensity that made her feel as though she were being dissected. Because he believed love was a precursor to loss, every interaction was a calculated distance. He was protecting her body, but he was guarding his own soul with a ferocity that bordered on madness. "I don't care what you asked for," he replied, his voice flat. "In this keep, my word is the only law that matters." He stood up and walked away, leaving her once again in the company of the silent, resentful warriors. Aelira felt a strange flicker of something that wasn't fear, a spark of curiosity about the man behind the stone mask. She realized that Kael wasn't just an outcast. He was a man living in a self-imposed exile, surrounding himself with iron and ice to keep the world at bay. She touched the pulse point at her neck, feeling the bond thrumming with a dark, heavy energy. He was protecting her, but he was also keeping her at a distance that felt like its own kind of prison. Chapter 6. The Blood in the Bone. The afternoon shadows were stretching long and thin across the infirmary when Aelira found Kael. He was stripped to the waist, his back to her as he struggled to reach a jagged tear in his shoulder, a souvenir from a border skirmish she hadn't even heard. The sight of his skin stopped her in her tracks. He was a map of tragedy, covered in silver scars that told a story of 100 battles he should have lost. Because the bond was singing a mournful, urgent song in her veins, she couldn't turn away. She stepped into the room, the scent of copper and medicinal herbs thick in the air. "Let me," she whispered, reaching for the bowl of clean water and the linen strips on the table. Kael stiffened, his muscles rippling like a disturbed lake. He turned his head, his profile sharp and dangerous in the dim light. He looked ready to snap at her, to order her back to her cold tower, but the exhaustion in his eyes held his tongue. He stayed silent as she moved behind him, her fingers trembling as she dipped the cloth into the water. When she first touched his skin, he flinched as if she had burned him. The bond didn't just spark this time, it roared, a wave of his physical pain washing over her, followed by a crushing sense of loneliness that nearly brought her to her knees. "You're hurt," she said, her voice barely a breath. "It's nothing," he grunted, though his breath hitched as she cleaned the wound. Aelira worked in silence, her movements becoming more confident as she felt the heat radiating from him. She wasn't the perfect bride here. She was just a woman with steady hands healing a man who had forgotten how to be touched. She could feel the heavy, jagged rhythm of his heart through his back, a wild thing trapped in a cage of ribs. As she applied the salve, her fingers lingered longer than necessary, tracing the edge of a scar that ran from his shoulder to his spine. It was a deep, ancient mark, different from the fresh tear she was tending. "Who did this to you?" she asked, her curiosity overriding her fear. Kael went perfectly still. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees, the silence becoming so sharp it felt like it could draw blood. He turned around slowly, his chest inches from hers, trapping her between his body and the stone wall. The golden light in his eyes was fierce, a warning of a coming storm. He reached out, his hand hovering near her throat, his thumb brushing the sensitive skin just above her collarbone. The touch was electric, a searing contact that made her world tilt and blur. "My brother," he hissed, the words dripping with a decade of accumulated venom. "He didn't just take my birthright, Aelira. He took the only thing that ever mattered." The revelation was a punch to her gut. The alpha who had rejected her wasn't just a cruel leader. He was the man who had shattered Kael first. She saw the flash of an image through the bond, a golden-haired woman screaming as a bond was severed by force, a sound of a soul tearing in half. Aelira gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as the weight of his grief threatened to drown her. Kael saw the realization in her eyes and recoiled, his face hardening back into a mask of iron. He looked at her not as a mate, but as a reminder of everything he had lost. "Don't look at me with pity," he warned, his voice a low, dangerous snarl. He stepped closer, his breath hot against her cheek. For a heartbeat, the tension between them was so thick it felt as though they were sharing the same air, the same heartbeat. His eyes dropped to her lips, and for a second she thought he might actually kiss her, to claim her not out of duty, but out of a desperate, clawing need to feel something other than pain. She leaned in, her heart hammering against her ribs like a drum, her soul reaching out for the comfort of his touch. But just as their lips were about to meet, Kael jerked away as if he had been struck. "Go to your room," he commanded, his voice trembling with a suppressed rage that wasn't directed at her, but at the bond itself. He turned his back on her, his posture rigid and unreachable. Aelira stood in the center of the infirmary, her body humming with a frustrated, aching desire that felt like a fever. She had seen the truth behind the mask, and it was more terrifying than the silence. Kael wasn't just protecting her. He was fighting a war against the very connection that was keeping them both alive. As she walked back to her cold, empty tower, she knew the safe walls of the Black Crag were just another kind of battlefield. Chapter 7. The Echo of Broken Glass. Frost crawled across the interior stones of the keep like a frozen web, tracing the jagged lines of Aelira's growing isolation. She paced the length of the solar, the hem of her borrowed woolen gown whispering against the floor in a restless, frantic rhythm. Because she had been traded from one cage of stone to another, the silence of the Black Crag began to feel like a physical pressure against her eardrums. She found herself reaching for the pulse at her throat every few minutes, tracking the heavy, subterranean thrum of Kael's heartbeat through the bond. It was the only thing that felt real in this fortress of ghosts, a tether that kept her from drifting away into the gray mountain mist. "You look like a trapped bird," a voice rasped from the shadows of the doorway. Aelira spun around, her heart leaping into her throat as Kael stepped into the dim light of the flickering wall sconce. He looked haggard, his dark hair damp with melted snow and his jaw shadowed by several days of stubble. He didn't come closer, choosing instead to lean against the doorframe with a weary, guarded grace. Since the moment in the infirmary, he had treated her like a porcelain doll filled with gunpowder, something to be watched from a distance, but never ignited. The tension between them had reached a frequency that made the very air feel thick, a shimmering wall of unspoken words and suppressed heat. "I am not trapped," Aelira replied, her voice sounding foreign to her own ears. "I am simply waiting." Waiting for what? Kael asked, his golden eyes narrowing as they tracked the movement of her hands. For Marcus to realize his mistake? For the council to demand your return? The mention of the Alpha made Aelira's stomach twist into a cold, hard knot. She walked toward him, her courage fueled by a sudden, sharp spike of resentment that flared through the connection. Because he was projecting his own fears of abandonment onto her, she felt the need to strike back, to break the glass wall he had built between them. She stopped just a foot away, the heat of his body radiating toward her like a furnace in the dead of winter. The scent of him, cedar, ozone, and ancient rain, swirled around her, making her head swim with a dizzying, dangerous longing. "I am waiting for you to stop looking at me like I am a ghost," she whispered, her eyes searching his for a single crack in the iron. Kael's breath hitched, a sharp sound in the quiet room that echoed the jump of his heart. He reached out, his hand hovering near her cheek before he caught himself and curled his fingers into a tight, white-knuckled fist. The bond roared in response, a tidal wave of his desire crashing against her mental shores with enough force to make her knees tremble. He wanted her, she could feel the hunger in him, a raw and starving thing that had been denied for too long. But beneath the hunger was a layer of obsidian fear, a terror that if he touched her, he would be granting the universe permission to destroy him again. "You don't understand," he groaned, his voice breaking with the weight of his own restraint. "Every time I look at you, I see the face of a war I cannot win." He turned to leave, but Aelira reached out, her fingers catching the rough leather of his sleeve. The contact was like a lightning strike, a jolt of pure, unadulterated energy that threw both of them into a psychic tailspin. She saw his brother's face again, Marcus's cruel, triumphant smile as he tore a bond apart with forbidden magic. She felt the searing agony of Kael's first mate dying in his arms, her soul unspooling like silk thread in a hurricane. Because she was now seeing the depth of the wound Marcus had inflicted, her heart broke for the man who had been left to rot in the cold. He didn't just take her, Aelira realized aloud, her voice trembling with the shock of the vision. He took your ability to believe in anything but pain. Kael ripped his arm away, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unbridled fury. He looked like a wolf backed into a corner, his teeth bared, and his eyes glowing with a lethal amber light. He didn't speak. He couldn't. The truth was a weapon he wasn't prepared to face. He stormed out of the solar, the heavy oak door slamming behind him with a sound like a cannon blast. Aelira sank to the floor, her fingers tracing the stones where he had stood, her own soul crying out for a connection that felt as though it were being strangled by the shadows of the past. Chapter 8: The Shadow of the Blood Moon. The atmosphere in the Great Hall was thick with the scent of wet fur and impending violence as the scouts returned from the southern borders. Aelira stood on the balcony, her fingers gripping the stone railing so hard the edges bit into her palms. Below, Kael was pacing in front of his warriors, his movements sharp and predatory as he listened to the reports. Because the bond was humming with a low-frequency alarm, she knew before the scout even spoke that the peace of the Black Crag was over. The Alpha wasn't content with humiliating her. He was coming to reclaim the prize he had discarded. "They've crossed the Grey River," the scout panted, his chest heaving under a blood-stained tunic. "Marcus is leading them himself. He says you stole his property, Kael." The word property echoed through the hall, a cold and clinical insult that made Aelira's blood boil. She watched Kael stop his pacing, his entire body going preternaturally still as he stared into the hearth. The firelight played across his features, highlighting the jagged scars and the absolute lack of mercy in his eyes. He didn't look like a man preparing for a fight. He looked like a man preparing for a massacre. The warriors around him began to sharpen their blades, the metallic rasp filling the room with a grim, rhythmic soundtrack of war. "He wants a war?" Kael said, his voice a whisper that carried more weight than a shout. "Then I will give him one that will burn his lineage to the ground." Aelira descended the stairs, her presence drawing the eyes of the warriors like a magnet. She walked straight to Kael, ignoring the warnings of his lieutenants. She saw the way his hands were shaking, not with fear, but with an adrenaline-fueled rage that threatened to consume him. Because she was the catalyst for this disaster, she felt a crushing weight of responsibility that threatened to drown her. She reached for his hand, but he pulled away before she could make contact, his gaze fixed on the maps spread across the table. "You need to leave," he commanded, his voice devoid of any emotion. "There is a tunnel beneath the keep. My best trackers will take you to the coast." "I am not leaving," Aelira countered, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "I am the reason he is here. I will stay and face him." Kael finally looked at her, and the intensity of his gaze was like a physical blow. He stepped toward her, his shadow swallowing her whole as he loomed over her. He looked desperate, his eyes searching hers for a single sign of the submission she had been raised to give. But she didn't blink. She didn't back down. Because she was finally choosing her own path, the fear that had defined her life was being replaced by a cold, sharp-edged determination. "You don't understand what he is," Kael hissed, his fingers gripping her shoulders with a frantic strength. "He doesn't want you, Aelira. He wants to destroy me by taking you back and breaking you in front of me. He is a monster who feeds on the things other people love." "Then don't let him," she replied, her hand finally finding his cheek and holding him there. The touch acted like a grounding wire, the chaotic energy in Kael's body flowing into hers and leveling out. The bond flared with a blinding, white-hot intensity, a sensation of two souls clicking into place like the gears of a massive, ancient clock. For a heartbeat, the war and the wolves and the cold mountains vanished. There was only the heat of his skin and the desperate, pulsing rhythm of the connection. Kael leaned into her hand, a single choked sob escaping his throat as his forehead dropped to rest against hers. "I can't lose you," he whispered, the admission a crack in the foundation of his iron soul. "I cannot do it again." "Then fight for me," she urged, her voice a low, melodic promise. "Not because I am property, not because I am a duty. Fight for me because I am yours." The declaration was a spark in a room full of dry tinder. Kael's eyes snapped open, the molten gold burning with a new, terrifying clarity. He looked at her not as a burden, but as a queen, the one thing in the world worth burning everything down for. He pulled her into his arms, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that tasted of salt and desperation and 1,000 years of loneliness. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a collision of two starving things, finding a feast in the middle of a famine. But even as the passion flared, a horn blast echoed through the mountains, a long, low sound of doom that signaled the arrival of the blood moon. Chapter 9. The Brink of the Abyss. The night was a canvas of blood and fire as the first of Marcus's vanguard reached the gates of the Black Crag. Aelira stood in the courtyard, her fingers curled around the hilt of a silver-edged dagger Kael had given her before he went to the ramparts. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and the metallic tang of fresh blood, a sensory overload that made her wolf howl in the back of her mind. Because the bond was shrieking with the agony of every blow Kael took on the walls, she felt as though she were being torn apart from the inside out. Each clash of steel felt like a hammer blow to her own heart. "He's coming for you!" a voice screamed from above, followed by the sound of a body hitting the cobbles with a sickening thud. Aelira looked up to see the battlements crawling with the shadow wolves of the blood moon. They were larger than Kael's warriors, fueled by Marcus's dark magic and a hunger for total domination. She saw Kael in the center of the fray, his form a blur of fur and silver claws as he tore through the enemy with a ferocity that bordered on madness. He was a god of war, a force of nature that refused to be extinguished. But for every wolf he dropped, 2 more took its place. The sheer numbers of the Alpha's pack were beginning to tell, the defensive lines of the keep crumbling under the relentless pressure. Suddenly, a shockwave of cold energy rippled through the courtyard, extinguishing the torches and plunging the world into a terrifying, unnatural twilight. The obsidian gates, which had held against the battering rams, began to glow with a sickly purple light before they shattered into 1,000 jagged shards. Out of the smoke stepped Marcus, his eyes glowing with a dark, necrotic power that made the very ground beneath his feet wither and die. He looked at Aelira, a cruel, possessive smile spreading across his face. "Did you really think you could run from your destiny, little wolf?" Marcus asked, his voice echoing with 1,000 overlapping whispers. Aelira stood her ground, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She felt Kael's presence shifting, his wolf letting out a roar of pure, unadulterated agony as he sensed the alpha's proximity to his mate. Because the bond was now a bridge for Marcus's malice, she felt a sharp, stabbing pain in her chest, a psychic needle trying to thread its way through the connection. Marcus wasn't just here to take her. He was here to use her as a conduit to finish what he had started years ago with Kael's first bond. "I am not yours to take," Aelira spat, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her throat. Marcus laughed, a sound that carried no warmth, only the dry rattle of a tomb. He raised his hand and a bolt of dark energy shot toward her, intended to paralyze and bind. But before it could reach her, a massive shadow intercepted the strike. Kael landed in front of her, his fur singed and his body covered in deep, bleeding gashes. He didn't look back. He simply stood as a shield between her and the monster. The bond between them was screaming now, a high-pitched, agonizing vibration that threatened to shatter their very souls. "My brother!" Marcus sneered, his eyes flicking over Kael's battered form. "Still playing the hero for a woman who will only ever be a memory of your failure." "She is more than you will ever deserve," Kael rasped, his voice a low, guttural snarl. The two alphas collided with the force of a mountain falling into the sea. The battle around them ceased as the warriors watched the two brothers tear at each other with a hatred that spanned lifetimes. But it wasn't a fair fight. Marcus was using magic that defied the laws of the pack, his strikes landing with a force that sent Kael reeling back toward the edge of the stone balcony. Aelira watched in horror as Kael's strength began to fade, his movements slowing as the dark energy drained his life force. "If I cannot have her, then no one will," Marcus roared, his hand glowing with a lethal, concentrated light as he prepared for the final strike. Because she knew that Kael would die for her, Aelira realized that she had to be the one to change the outcome. She didn't think. She didn't plan. She simply threw herself into the path of the strike, her soul opening wide to the bond. She didn't try to resist the energy. She pulled it in, using the connection as a siphon to drag the darkness away from Kael. The pain was unlike anything she had ever imagined, a sensation of being burned alive from the inside out. But as she fell, she saw the light return to Kael's eyes, a look of pure, horrified realization as he saw her sacrifice. The world went black, the sound of Kael's scream being the last thing she heard before the abyss swallowed her whole. Chapter 10. The fracture of Soul's consciousness returned not as a light, but as a slow, agonizing crawl through a field of broken glass. Aelira's lungs felt heavy, filled with the phantom smoke of the battle and the lingering, oily taste of Marcus's necrotic magic. Because she had acted as a lightning rod for a strike meant to end Kael's life, her physical form felt fragile, a porcelain vessel held together by nothing but sheer, stubborn will. She opened her eyes to find the ceiling of her stone chamber, the familiar arrow slits now clogged with the gray, indifferent light of a mountain dawn. The silence was absolute, a stark and terrifying departure from the cacophony of war that had been the last thing she remembered. "Don't move," a voice commanded, sounding like gravel grinding against silk. Kael was sitting in the shadows beside her bed, his silhouette jagged and exhausted. He looked as if he hadn't slept in a century, his skin a shade of gray that matched the stones of the keep. He didn't reach for her. He sat with his hands clenched on his knees, his knuckles white and scarred. The bond between them was no longer a steady, rhythmic thrumming. It was a jagged, electric wire that sparked with every breath she took, sending sharp stabs of his reflected agony through her chest. Because the magic had tainted the connection, every thought she had felt like it was being filtered through a layer of cold poison. "Is he dead?" Aelira rasped, her throat feeling as though she had swallowed hot coals. "No," Kael spat, the word dripping with a lethal, concentrated bitterness. He retreated into the mist when the wall collapsed. He took half of my guard with him as trophies. The weight of the failure settled over the room like a shroud. Aelira tried to sit up, but a scream died in her throat as a bolt of phantom fire shot down her spine. Kael was at her side in an instant, his hands hovering over her shoulders but refusing to make contact. He looked terrified of her, as if her very skin were made of the same dark energy that had almost unmade her. Since she had seen the depths of his past, she knew that his distance wasn't a lack of care. It was a frantic, desperate attempt to keep his own darkness from swallowing what was left of her. "You shouldn't have done it," he whispered, his golden eyes burning with a mixture of rage and a soul-crushing guilt. "You were supposed to be the one thing that remained untainted by this family's curse." "I chose to save you, Kael," she countered, her voice gaining a thin, wavering strength. "I am not a prize to be kept polished in a cabinet. I am your mate." The word mate seemed to trigger a physical reaction in him, a flinch that made his muscles ripple with a suppressed violence. He stood up and paced the narrow room, his movements reminiscent of a caged predator. Because the bond was now a conduit for the poison Marcus had injected into the strike, Kael was feeling her physical pain as if it were his own, amplified by the psychic resonance of their union. He stopped at the window, staring out at the scorched courtyard where his people were currently burning the dead. "The bond is changing," he said, his back to her. "It's not just a tether anymore. It's a parasite." Aelira felt the truth of his words in her own marrow. The connection was tightening, pulling them together with a force that felt like it might snap her ribs. It was no longer a choice or a natural progression, it was a survival mechanism that was becoming dangerously aggressive. She could feel his hunger, his cold, and his absolute, unyielding hatred for his brother, as if they were her own emotions. Because they were now sharing the same psychic space, the boundaries of her identity were beginning to blur, leaving her wondering where her fear ended and his rage began. Chapter 11. The Mirror's Edge. 3 days later, the air in the Black Crag felt like a bowstring drawn to the point of snapping. Aelira stood before the silvered mirror in her solar, her fingers tracing the faint purple veins that now spiderwebbed across her collarbone, the permanent brand of Marcus's magic. She looked like a survivor of a shipwreck, her eyes too large for her face and her skin the color of old parchment. Since the battle, she had begun to hear whispers in the back of her mind, echoes of Kael's thoughts that didn't belong to her. She knew when he was angry, when he was patrolling the northern wall, and most disturbingly, when he was thinking about the way her neck had felt under his thumb. "You're doing it again," Kael said, appearing in the doorway without a sound. He walked toward her, his presence filling the small room until the walls seemed to shrink. He stopped behind her, their eyes meeting in the reflection of the glass. The contrast was striking. She was a fractured mirror of his own internal torment. He reached out, his hand slowly descending to cover the marks on her collarbone. As his skin met hers, the room seemed to tilt. The bond flared with a blinding, white-hot intensity that made both of them gasp. It wasn't a spark. It was a fusion. "I can feel your heartbeat," Aelira whispered, her breath hitching as her pulse synced perfectly with his. "It's too loud, Kael. It's drowning out everything else." "Because he didn't just strike us," Kael realized, his voice trembling with a terrifying clarity. "He used the bond as a bridge to fuse our life forces. He didn't want to kill us, Aelira. He wanted to make us so dependent on each other that one cannot exist without the other." The horror of the revelation settled into her bones. This was Marcus's true revenge, to turn their love into a lethal dependency. If Kael was hurt, she would bleed. If she died, his soul would shatter beyond repair. Because they were now two halves of a single damaged whole, the stakes of the coming war had shifted from territory to basic existence. Kael's grip on her shoulder tightened, his thumb brushing against her jaw with a tenderness that was more frightening than his rage. He looked at her as if she were a miracle and a curse all at once. "Why do you act like you don't feel anything?" she asked, her voice cracking as she turned in his arms to face him. "I can feel the fire in you, Kael. I can feel the way you want to scream until the mountains crumble. Stop lying to me." Kael let out a low, guttural sound, a mix of a sob and a snarl. He crushed her against his chest, his face burying into the crook of her neck. He was shaking, the iron walls of his composure finally disintegrating under the pressure of the fused bond. Since he had spent a decade believing he was a ghost, the sudden influx of her warmth and her life was overwhelming his senses. He wanted to devour her and protect her in the same breath, a primal conflict that made his wolf roar with a frustrated, aching desire. "I act like I feel nothing because if I let go, I will burn the world down to keep you," he confessed into her skin. He pulled back just enough to look her in the eyes, his golden irises swirling with a dark, possessive light. The air between them was electric, charged with a physical tension that made the hair on Aelira's arms stand up. She reached for him, her fingers tangling in his hair, her soul demanding the completion that the bond was screaming for. They were on the edge of a precipice, a point of no return where their identities would be lost to the union. But just as he leaned in to claim her, the heavy iron bell of the watchtower began to toll, a frantic, rhythmic warning of a new threat. Chapter 12. The Price of the Blood Link. The war room was a hive of frantic activity, but for Aelira, everything was muffled, as if she were underwater. She stood at Kael's side, her hand resting on the table next to his. She didn't need to look at the maps to know what the scouts were saying. She could feel the proximity of the blood moon through the connection, a cold, oily sensation that made her skin crawl. Marcus wasn't coming with an army this time. He was coming with a ritual. The scouts had found the ritual sites, circles of black salt and goat skulls placed at the cardinal points of Kael's territory. "He's widening the link," Kael said, his voice cold and clinical as he stared at the map. "He's not just binding us to each other, he's binding us to the land itself. If he finishes the ritual, he can drain the life out of everyone in the Black Crag through our connection." The warriors around the table fell silent, their eyes shifting toward Aelira with a renewed sense of fear. She was no longer just the Alpha's guest. She was the potential source of their extinction. Because she had been raised to be useful, the idea that her very existence was now a weapon against the people who had protected her was a soul-shattering realization. She looked at Kael, seeking some sign of the rejection she expected. But he was looking at her with a fierce, unwavering loyalty that made her heart ache. "We have to break the link," Aelira said, her voice sounding far away. "The only way to break a blood link of this magnitude," the elder priest murmured from the corner, his voice heavy with dread, "is for the source to be extinguished. One of you would have to die before the ritual is completed." The silence that followed was absolute. Kael's hand slammed onto the table, the wood cracking under the force of his blow. His eyes blazed with a molten, lethal gold, his wolf surfacing in a way that made the other warriors scramble back toward the walls. He looked like he wanted to tear the priest's throat out for even suggesting the thought. Because his first mate had died to satisfy his brother's ego, the idea of losing Aelira to the same man was driving him toward a precipice of madness. "No one is dying," Kael growled, the sound vibrating through the floorboards. "We are going to the source. We are going to kill Marcus before he can speak the final word." "It's a trap, Kael," Aelira whispered, her hand finding his and squeezing with a desperate strength. "He wants you to come to him. He wants the link to be at its strongest when you reach the center of the circle." "Let him trap me," Kael replied, turning to look at her with a terrifying, calm resolve. "He thinks he has shackled me to you to make me weak. He doesn't realize that you are the only thing that makes me unstoppable." He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers for a fleeting, intense second. Through the bond, he sent her a vision of the future, not one of death, but of a world where they were free from the shadows of their past. It was a promise made in the face of a god, a defiance of fate itself. But as they prepared to mount their horses and ride into the heart of the storm, Aelira felt a sharp, sudden coldness in her chest. The ritual had begun. She looked down at her hands to see the purple veins beginning to glow with a sickly, rhythmic light. They were running out of time. The bond was no longer a bridge, it was a fuse, and it was burning toward the end. As they rode out of the gates of the Black Crag, the sky turned the color of a fresh bruise, and the wind began to howl with the voices of 1,000 vengeful ghosts. Because they were fighting for more than their lives, the air felt thick with the weight of destiny. Aelira gripped the reins, her soul screaming for the man riding beside her, her heart a drumbeat of war in the silence of the dying world. Chapter 13. The Hunger of the Hollow. The sky above the jagged peaks of the Black Crag had turned the color of a fresh bruise, swirling with unnatural, violet-tinged clouds that pulsed in time with Aelira's failing heartbeat. Every hoofbeat of her mare sent a jarring spike of agony through her spine, a reminder that the blood link was no longer a bridge. It was a parasite. Because Marcus was tightening the ritual's grip from his hidden sanctuary, the very air felt like it was thickening into lead. She looked at Kael, who rode beside her like a god of ruined things, his jaw set in a line of such absolute ferocity that it made the surrounding forest seem to cower. "Stay close," Kael commanded, his voice a low, vibrating growl that she felt in her marrow rather than heard with her ears. He didn't look at her, but she could feel his consciousness wrapping around hers like a protective shroud. Since the fusion of their life force, his internal monologue had become a constant, low-frequency hum in the back of her mind, a chaotic mixture of tactical slaughter and a terrifying, bone-deep devotion to her survival. He was tracking every breath she took, every wince of pain, and every flicker of her fading strength. Because he was terrified of losing her, his wolf was pushed to the very edge of a mindless, predatory rage that threatened to consume his humanity. "I can feel him, Kael," Aelira whispered, her fingers cramping around the reins as a fresh wave of nausea rolled over her. "He's at the Heartstone. He's waiting for us to bring the final piece of the tether to him." Kael's horse reared, sensing the sudden spike of dark energy radiating from the mountain pass ahead. He settled the beast with a sharp, authoritative jerk, his eyes glowing with a molten gold that seemed to pierce through the supernatural gloom. He turned to her then, and for a fleeting second, the warrior mask slipped. He looked at the glowing purple veins on her neck, his expression one of such raw, unadulterated grief that it nearly broke her heart. He reached across the space between their mounts, his hand cupping her cheek with a tenderness that felt like a prayer. "He thinks he is drawing us into a trap," Kael said, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "He doesn't realize that I would walk through the fires of the underworld just to get my hands on his throat." The touch was electric, a searing contact that made the bond flare with a white-hot intensity. Aelira leaned into his palm, her eyes fluttering shut as his strength poured into her like wine into a parched throat. She wasn't the useful daughter anymore, and she wasn't the discarded bride. She was the anchor for the most dangerous man in the North. And for the first time in her life, she felt a sense of belonging that wasn't tied to a duty. Because she was finally choosing to love him, the fear of the ritual began to recede, replaced by a cold, sharp-edged desire for justice. "We do this together," she promised, her voice ringing with a new, steel-edged clarity. "Whatever happens at the stone, we don't let go." Chapter 14. The Geometry of Desire. They reached the cave entrance just as the first moon rose, a bloated, sickly orb that cast long, distorted shadows across the snow. Kael dismounted and pulled Aelira into his arms, his grip so tight she could feel the frantic, heavy thud of his heart against her ribs. The cave was a mouth of darkness, exhaling the scent of damp earth and ancient, forbidden incense. Because the ritual was reaching its zenith, the walls seemed to vibrate with a low-pitched hum that made Aelira's teeth ache. Kael led her inside, his hand never leaving hers, his body acting as a constant shield against the oppressive weight of the atmosphere. "Wait!" Kael rasped, pulling her into a shallow alcove just as the tunnel widened into a massive, crystal-lined cavern. The air here was warmer, charged with a static tension that made Aelira's hair stand on end. She looked at Kael, her breath hitching as she saw the way the light from the crystals played across his rugged features. He was looking at her with an intensity that made her world tilt, a look of pure, unadulterated hunger that had nothing to do with the bond and everything to do with the woman standing before him. Since they were on the precipice of a battle they might not survive, the social barriers and the iron walls of his restraint were finally crumbling. "Aelira," he whispered, his name for her sounding like a sacred vow. He backed her against the smooth crystal wall, his hands framing her face as he leaned in until their foreheads touched. The bond wasn't just humming, it was screaming, a high-voltage connection that made every nerve ending in her body catch fire. She reached for him, her fingers tangling in the dark silk of his hair, her soul demanding the completion she had been denied at the altar. Because she was no longer afraid of the fire in him, she pulled him closer, her lips seeking the warmth of his in a desperate, silent plea. When his mouth finally crashed against hers, it wasn't a kiss. It was a collision. It tasted of salt, storm clouds, and a decade of suppressed longing. It was a claiming that went beyond the physical, a fusion of two souls that had been broken in the same way and were now finding a perfect, jagged fit. Kael groaned into her mouth, a low, guttural sound of surrender as he pressed his body against hers, his hands wandering over her curves with a frantic, possessive energy. He wasn't the ghost of the crag anymore. He was a man who was finally, violently alive. "I have wanted this since the moment you looked at me in the shadows of the wedding," he confessed against her lips, his breath hot and ragged. "I have wanted to tear the world apart just to hear you say my name like that." Aelira arched her back, her body humming with a pleasure so intense it felt like a different kind of pain. She felt the power of his wolf beneath his skin, a wild, untamed force that was now perfectly synchronized with her own pulse. Because they were finally choosing each other, the blood link began to change, the purple light of the poison fading into a brilliant, steady silver. They were no longer victims of a ritual. They were the creators of their own destiny. But just as the passion reached a breaking point, a cold, mocking laugh echoed through the cavern, shattering the moment like a pane of glass. Chapter 15. The Treachery of Blood. Marcus stood on a raised dais in the center of the cavern, surrounded by a circle of black obsidian pillars that pulsed with a rhythmic, necrotic light. He looked older, his skin stretched thin over his skull, and his eyes glowing with a madness that made Aelira's blood turn to ice. In front of him, suspended in a cage of dark energy, was a lock of Aelira's hair and a vial of Kael's blood, the physical components of the final binding. Because he had been watching them, his smile was a jagged wound of triumph that made the very air feel oily. "How touching," Marcus sneered, his voice echoing off the crystal walls like the rattling of dry bones. "The two broken things have found a way to pretend they are whole. It's almost a shame I have to ruin the illusion." Kael stepped in front of Aelira, his wolf surging to the surface with a roar that shook the stalactites from the ceiling. His fur was a shadow against the glowing crystals, his claws extending with a lethal, metallic snick. He didn't waste time with words. He lunged, a blur of fur and fury intended to end the threat in a single strike. But Marcus was faster, his hand flying out to catch Kael in midair with a blast of dark energy that sent the massive wolf crashing into the stone floor. "Kael!" Aelira screamed, her heart shattering as she felt his physical pain through the bond. She tried to run to him, but Marcus raised his other hand and a wall of invisible force slammed her back against the crystal wall. She watched in horror as Marcus stepped down from the dais, his boots clicking on the stone with a terrifying rhythmic finality. He walked over to Kael's crumpled form, his eyes fixed on the man who had always been his shadow, his rival, and his greatest failure. Because he was a monster who fed on loss, he savored the moment, his fingers sparking with the final incantation of the ritual. "You were never meant to love him, Aelira," Marcus said, turning his gaze toward her with a look of chilling pity. "You were meant to be the instrument of his final destruction. Watch now as the bond you so cherish becomes the knife that cuts his soul in half." He began to chant, the words a discordant, jarring melody that made the crystals in the cavern begin to shatter one by one. Aelira felt the connection to Kael begin to twist, the silver light turning back into a corrosive, burning purple. It was a sensation of being unmade, of her very identity being shredded and fed into the black hole of Marcus's ambition. She looked at Kael, who was struggling to stand, his eyes meeting hers with a look of such absolute heart-wrenching love that it gave her the strength to fight the darkness. "Kael, don't let him!" she cried out, her voice a beacon in the storm of necrotic energy. But it was too late. Marcus reached into the cage of energy and crushed the vial of blood, the liquid vaporizing into a cloud of red mist that settled over the cavern. Aelira felt a sharp, sudden coldness in her chest, a sensation of a door closing forever. The link was no longer a bridge. It was a wall. She saw Kael reach out for her, his hand trembling, his eyes fading from gold to a dull, lifeless gray. Because the ritual had reached its completion, the man she loved was being replaced by a stranger, his memories of her being erased by the sheer force of his brother's malice. "No," Kael whispered, the word a dying ember in the dark. The cavern erupted in a final, blinding flash of violet light, throwing Aelira into a world of absolute, terrifying silence. When the light faded, Marcus was standing over her, his hand gripping her chin with a bruising strength. Kael was gone, not dead but absent, his body standing like a hollow shell against the far wall. The bond was quiet, a dead wire that carried nothing but the cold, indifferent hum of the mountain. Marcus looked at her with a grin that promised a lifetime of servitude. "Now," the Alpha whispered, "we begin the real work." Chapter 16. The Architecture of Absence. The silence inside the cavern didn't just ring, it roared. It was a thick, suffocating vacuum where the vibrant, rhythmic pulse of Kael's soul used to reside. Aelira stood trembling against the jagged crystal wall, her fingers clawing at the stone until her nails bled. But she felt nothing through the bond. Because Marcus had slammed an iron shutter down across their connection, the interior of her mind felt like a house that had been stripped of its furniture and its warmth in a single, violent night. She looked at Kael, the man who had just kissed her with the hunger of a dying star, and saw only a statue made of meat and moonlight. "Kael," she whispered, the name falling like a lead weight into the stillness. He didn't blink. His golden eyes, once swirling with a protective, possessive fire, were now flat and opaque, like coins dropped into a deep well. He stood with his arms hanging loosely at his sides, his chest rising and falling in a mechanical rhythm that carried no emotional resonance. Marcus stepped toward him, trailing a hand over Kael's shoulder with a sickening, brotherly familiarity that made Aelira's stomach heave. Since the ritual had successfully cauterized the link, Kael was no longer a person. He was a weapon with its safety engaged, waiting for the Alpha's finger to pull the trigger. "He can't hear you, Aelira," Marcus purred, his voice echoing with a triumphant, jagged edge. "I didn't just break the bond. I rewrote the priority of his instinct. To him, you are no longer a mate. You are simply background noise." The humiliation of the wedding altar felt like a paper cut compared to this amputation. Aelira watched as Marcus leaned in, whispering a command into Kael's ear that she couldn't catch. Because she was a private person who had finally opened her vault to one man, seeing that man look through her as if she were made of glass was a soul-shattering erasure. She lunged forward, her silver-edged dagger flashing in the dim light, but she was stopped by a wall of invisible force that sent her sprawling onto the cold, damp floor. "You're just the replacement anyway," Marcus added, his eyes dancing with a cruel, flickering light. "Did he tell you about the first one? About how she screamed when I did this to her? He didn't fight for her then, and he won't fight for you now because he simply doesn't remember why he should care." Aelira looked up from the ground, her vision blurring with tears of pure, unadulterated rage. She saw Kael turn his head toward her. His expression remains as blank as a fresh sheet of snow. There was no recognition, no spark of the man who had promised to burn the world down for her. Because she had been raised to earn love through usefulness, the realization that she was now entirely useless to him was a lethal blow to her identity. She felt the hollow space in her chest begin to fill with a cold, heavy resignation, a feeling that she was destined to be discarded by every man she had ever tried to trust. Chapter 17. The Weight of Ghostly Limbs. The journey back to the Blood Moon territory was a nightmare of rhythmic hoofbeats and freezing rain that washed the scent of cedar and ozone from the air. Aelira was bound to her horse, her wrists raw from the coarse hemp rope, while Kael rode behind Marcus like a shadow that had lost its owner. He didn't look at her once, even when her horse stumbled on the slick mountain pass and she let out a sharp cry of pain. Since the magic had severed their empathy, he was no longer a shield. He was just another guard in her brother-in-law's private army. "Why are you doing this?" Aelira asked, her voice cracking as the gates of the Blood Moon packhouse loomed in the distance. Marcus didn't turn around, his posture in the saddle one of arrogant, effortless control. Because Kael was always the better warrior, the better strategist, and the better man. But I am the one with the crown, and I intend to keep it by ensuring he is nothing but a hollow shell that carries my sword. They entered the courtyard where her humiliation had begun, the same wolves watching with a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. Aelira was dragged from her horse and thrown into a cell beneath the great hall, a place of damp stone and the distant sound of dripping water. Because the bond was a dead wire, she spent the hours scratching at the mortar between the stones, her mind looping through the memories of the Black Crag as if they were a dream she was trying to hold on to before it evaporated. She could feel Kael's physical proximity above her, a dull weight on her psychic ceiling that offered no comfort, only the agonizing reminder of what was missing. "He's coming," a voice whispered from the shadows of the neighboring cell. Aelira scrambled to the bars, her heart hammering a frantic, uneven rhythm. "Who? Kael?" "The one who is left," the voice replied, a rasping sound of a long-term prisoner. "But he won't come as a savior. He comes as the Alpha's executioner." The cell door creaked open an hour later, the hinges screaming in the silence. Kael stepped into the dim light of the torch, his massive frame filling the doorway and casting a long, intimidating shadow across the straw-covered floor. He held a tray of bread and water, but he set it down with a cold, clinical efficiency that lacked any of the tenderness she had come to expect. Because she was desperate to find a single crack in his armor, she stood up and walked toward him, her hands reaching out to touch the scars on his forearms that she had once healed with her own fingers. "Kael, look at me," she pleaded, her voice a low, melodic sob. "You told me I was the only thing worth fighting for. You told me you'd walk through fire." He looked at her then, but his eyes remained flat, the golden light replaced by a dull metallic gray. He didn't pull away, but he didn't lean in either. He stood like a man observing a strange animal in a cage, his head tilting slightly as he analyzed her distress. Since the ritual had erased the emotional weight of his memories, she was just a series of facts to him. A woman he had claimed, a woman his brother now held, a woman who was crying for reasons he couldn't comprehend. "The Alpha says you are to be prepared for the rebinding ceremony at dawn," Kael said, his voice a flat, emotionless drone. "The rebinding?" Aelira gasped, her world tilting on its axis. "He's going to force me to mate with him?" "It is the efficient path to stability," Kael replied, turning toward the door. Aelira felt a surge of pure, white-hot fury. She grabbed his arm, her nails digging into his skin, her soul screaming across the void. "You won't fight for me? After everything we did? After the way you looked at me in the cave?" Kael paused, his hand on the iron latch. For a fraction of a second, his pupils dilated, a tiny flicker of something old and primal struggling to reach the surface of his opaque eyes. But then he blinked, and the mask settled back into place, harder and colder than before. Because the magic was absolute, the man who had loved her was buried under 1,000 feet of ice. "I have no reason to fight," he said simply. He closed the door, the sound of the bolt sliding home echoing through the cell like the final shovel of dirt on a grave. Aelira sank to the floor, the silence of the bond finally breaking her. She realized then that Marcus hadn't just taken Kael. He had taken her ability to believe in the choice she had made. Chapter 18. The Silence of the Dying Moon. The hours before dawn were a slow, agonizing crawl through the wreckage of Aelira's spirit. She sat in the corner of her cell, the cold stone leaching the warmth from her body until she felt as though she were turning into granite herself. Because she had given up on the bond, the silence in her head was no longer a vacuum. It was a grave. She thought about the way Kael's heart had sounded against her ear, a rhythmic, powerful drum that had promised her safety. Now that drum was silent and she was alone in a world that only saw her as a tool for someone else's power. "I can't do this again," she whispered to the shadows, her voice a hollow shell of itself. She picked up a jagged piece of stone from the floor, her fingers tracing the sharp edge. If she broke the vessel, the ritual would have nothing to bind. If she died, Kael would at least be free from the burden of her existence, even if he didn't remember why it mattered. Because she had spent her life trying to be useful, the idea of a final, defiant act of uselessness felt like the only choice she had left. She pressed the stone against her wrist, the cold edge biting into her skin, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Suddenly, a sensation flickered in the back of her mind, a tiny, microscopic prickle of heat. It wasn't a thought, and it wasn't a memory. It was the feeling of a scent: cedar, ozone, and ancient rain. Aelira froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She searched the darkness of her own mind, reaching out for that tiny spark with a desperation that was almost physical. Was it a hallucination? A trick of the mind brought on by the trauma and the cold? Or was Kael still in there, fighting his way through the ice Marcus had poured into his veins? "Kael," she breathed, dropping the stone. The spark flickered again, followed by a sudden, sharp spike of physical pain. Not hers, but his. She felt a phantom ache in her shoulder, the same place she had healed in the infirmary. Because the physical scars were the only things Marcus couldn't erase, the body was remembering what the mind had been forced to forget. Aelira stood up, pressing her forehead against the iron bars of the cell, her soul screaming into the void with every ounce of strength she had left. She didn't ask him to save her. She didn't ask him to fight. She simply sang the melody of their bond into the silence, a wordless, melodic prayer for the man who was lost. "You won't fight for me?" she whispered, the question echoing up the stone stairs toward the hall where he stood guard. Silence followed, a long, agonizing stretch of time where the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, from somewhere deep in the keep, a sound erupted that made the very foundations of the Blood Moon territory tremble. It wasn't a howl, and it wasn't a shout. It was a roar of pure, unadulterated agony, a sound of a soul tearing itself back together through sheer, bloody-minded will. Aelira felt the bond snap back into place, not as a silver bridge or a purple parasite, but as a raw, bleeding wound that bound them together more tightly than any magic could ever achieve. The ice was cracking. The ghost was waking up. Chapter 19. The Anatomy of a Storm. The air inside the cell didn't just change, it disintegrated. Aelira slumped against the cold, weeping stone of the wall as the psychic void in her mind was suddenly filled with a roar of static and fire. It was a violent, unrefined reconnection, a jagged cable of raw emotion snapping back into place with the force of a thunderclap. Because Kael had spent the last several hours as a hollow vessel, the sudden influx of his own suppressed identity was hitting him like a physical mountain. She clutched her head, her teeth gritting against a sympathetic migraine that felt like a hot needle threading through her brain. "Kael," she gasped, her voice a fragile reed in the gale of his awakening. Through the bond, she felt his surroundings, the opulent, suffocating scent of the Alpha's private study, the cold weight of the silver-pommeled sword in his hand, and the flickering orange light of the hearth. But more than the sensory details, she felt his clarity. It was a terrifying, crystalline realization that his silence had been a betrayal of the only truth he had ever owned. He wasn't just remembering her. He was re-experiencing the exact moment in the cave where he had traded his solitude for her soul. Because Marcus had tried to turn his love into a weapon of war, Kael was now a creature made of pure, focused vengeance. "I am coming for you." His voice vibrated in her skull, no longer a flat drone but a promise of imminent slaughter. Aelira stood up, her legs shaking, but her heart finally beating in a rhythm she recognized. The hopelessness that had almost led her to the jagged stone on the floor vanished, replaced by a fierce incandescent heat. She looked at the iron door of her cell, no longer seeing a barrier but a temporary delay. Since she had spent her life trying to be chosen, hearing the man she loved declare war on his own blood just to reach her side was the ultimate validation of her existence. She pressed her palms against the iron, her skin humming with the residual energy of his intent. "I'd rather lose you fighting than lose you afraid," she whispered back into the link, echoing the words he had once used to describe his own cowardice. The response was a sudden, sharp spike of adrenaline that made her vision swim. She felt Kael move, not with the mechanical precision of a puppet, but with the explosive, unpredictable grace of a predator that had finally broken its chain. Above her, the muffled sounds of the keep changed from the rhythmic pacing of guards to the chaotic, high-pitched screams of men, who had realized too late that they were standing in the path of a hurricane. Because he was done hiding, Kael was no longer fighting for a territory. He was fighting for the very air in his lungs. Chapter 20. The Red Corridor. The sound of the lock shattering was the most beautiful music Aelira had ever heard. It wasn't a key turning. It was the sound of the entire iron mechanism being ripped from the stone by a force that defied logic. The door swung open with a violent, screeching protest, and there he was. Kael stood in the doorway, his leather armor shredded and his face splattered with blood that wasn't his own. He looked like a nightmare, his eyes glowing with a molten, lethal gold that seemed to illuminate the entire damp corridor. But when his gaze landed on her, the ferocity softened into a look of such profound, aching relief that she nearly fell. "Aelira," he rasped, his voice a broken melody of gravel and grace. He didn't wait for her to move. He bridged the gap between them in a single stride, his massive arms wrapping around her with a strength that would have been frightening if it weren't so desperate. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his breath coming in ragged, shuddering gasps that shook his entire frame. Because he had been a ghost for so long, the physical reality of her warmth was the only thing keeping him from drifting back into the darkness. Aelira held him, her fingers tangling in his matted hair, her tears soaking into his tunic as the bond hummed with a frantic, beautiful resonance. "You came back," she sobbed, her heart finally finding its home. "I never left," he whispered into her skin, his grip tightening as if he were afraid she might evaporate if he let go. "I was just under the ice. But I heard you. I heard you singing in the dark, and I realized that I would rather burn in hell for eternity than live another second in a world where I didn't know your name." He pulled back, his hands framing her face, his thumbs wiping away her tears with a tenderness that made her heart ache. But the moment of peace was short-lived. From the stairs above, the sound of heavy boots and the clattering of shields echoed through the stone passage. Marcus's personal guard was descending, a wall of steel and fur intended to crush the rebellion before it could reach the surface. Because Kael was now fighting with the clarity of a man who had nothing left to lose, he turned toward the threat with a smile that was more terrifying than any snarl. "Stay behind me," he commanded, his silver-edged sword catching the dim light of the corridor. Aelira didn't argue. She picked up a fallen mace from a guard Kael had already dispatched, her fingers curling around the cold metal with a grim determination. She wasn't a prize to be protected anymore. She was a partner in a war that was only just beginning. As the first wave of guards rounded the corner, Kael lunged, his body a blur of fur and silver claws. He fought with a war energy that was absolute, a whirlwind of violence that left nothing but broken steel and hushed whispers in its wake. Because they were finally fighting as one, the corridor felt less like a prison and more like a forge. Chapter 21. The Acceptance of the Storm. They reached the Great Hall just as the sun began to bleed over the horizon, casting a long crimson light across the field of battle. The room was a wreck of overturned tables and shattered glass, a visual representation of the life Aelira was finally leaving behind. In the center of the hall stood Marcus, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and a growing, desperate rage. He held a staff carved from the bone of an ancient alpha, the tip glowing with the same sickly purple light that had almost destroyed their bond. "You should have stayed in the dark, Kael," Marcus hissed, his voice trembling with the weight of his own failing power. "You think love makes you strong? It only gives me a bigger target to hit." Kael didn't answer. He walked toward his brother with a slow, deliberate gait that promised nothing but finality. Aelira stood at his side, her presence a steadying anchor for the storm of his rage. She felt the bond between them reaching out, no longer a fragile thread, but a massive, glowing tether that pulled the air around them into a swirling vortex of energy. Because she was finally ready to choose him, not out of duty, not out of fear, but out of a love that had survived the abyss. She reached for the connection with everything she had. "I accept it," she whispered, her voice carrying through the hall with the weight of a decree. "I accept the bond fully. I accept you, Kael, for everything you are and everything we will become." The declaration was the final key. The air in the hall erupted in a blinding, white-hot light as the bond completed itself. It wasn't a subtle shift. It was a cosmic realignment. Aelira felt her soul fuse with Kael's in a way that defied description, a sensation of being everywhere and nowhere, of having 1,000 years of strength flowing through her veins. She saw the world through his eyes, felt the earth through his paws, and tasted the victory through his hunger. Marcus recoiled as if he had been struck by lightning, his staff shattering into 1,000 pieces as the pure, unadulterated energy of their union washed over him. "This is impossible," Marcus screamed, his voice lost in the roar of the rising wind. "It's not impossible," Kael replied, his voice a chorus of 1,000 voices, both human and wolf. "It's just something you'll never understand because you've never been willing to risk everything for someone else." Kael lunged for the final time, his body transforming in midair into a wolf the size of a mountain lion, his fur glowing with a silver radiance that turned the morning shadows to ash. Marcus tried to raise his hands, but he was too slow. The battle was over before it began. As the two brothers collided, Aelira closed her eyes, her heart swelling with a power that was both ancient and new. Because she had finally been chosen, the war in her soul was over. The Alpha was defeated, but more importantly, the bride was finally free. Chapter 22. The Shattering of the Crown. The air in the Great Hall didn't just vibrate, it fractured. Aelira stood at the epicenter of a psychic hurricane, her lungs burning with the sudden atmospheric pressure of a bond that had moved from a whisper to a roar. Because she had finally surrendered every defensive wall she possessed, the connection to Kael was no longer a thread. It was a river of molten silver flowing through her veins. She felt his muscles bunch as if they were her own, the lethal power of his wolf form vibrating in her own marrow. As Kael lunged, a blur of fur and ancient, vengeful starlight, she didn't just watch the battle. She lived it through his eyes. "No!" Marcus shrieked, his voice cracking like dry parchment under the weight of his terror. The Alpha tried to summon a final shield of necrotic mist, his fingers clawing at the air to drain the life from the stones around him. But the darkness was sluggish, a dying ember compared to the solar flare of the completed union. Kael hit him with the force of a falling mountain, his massive paws pinning the tyrant to the blood-stained dais. Aelira felt the snap of Marcus's ribs through the link, a sickening, hollow crunch that signaled the end of a decade of oppression. Because Kael was now fueled by a love that had survived the void, he was no longer a man fighting a brother. He was justice personified. "This is for the silence," Kael's voice echoed in her mind, a chorus of growls and human grief. "This is for every soul you tried to hollow out." He didn't hesitate. With a final, decisive snap of his jaws, The dark magic that had sustained Marcus's reign was severed at the source. The Alpha went limp, his eyes fading into a dull, empty gray as the power he had stolen rushed out of him in a cold, whistling wind. Aelira felt a sharp, sudden snap in her own chest, the final tether of her old life breaking away. The weight of her family's expectations, the shame of the wedding altar, and the fear of being unfit vanished into the morning light. She was no longer a daughter of the blood moon, she was the heartbeat of the North. Chapter 23. The Silence After the Storm. The aftermath of the battle was a heavy, ringing silence that settled over the keep like wood smoke. Aelira walked through the wreckage of the great hall, her boots crunching on the shards of the bone staff and the broken glass of the chandeliers. The warriors of the blood moon stood in the shadows, their weapons lowered and their heads bowed in a silent, stunned submission. They weren't looking at a monster. They were looking at the true Alpha. Kael stood over the fallen body of his brother, his form slowly shifting back from wolf to man, his skin steaming in the cool morning air. "Kael," she whispered, her voice a soft anchor in the chaos. He turned toward her, his chest heaving and his face smeared with the soot of the final explosion. He looked exhausted, a man who had carried the weight of the world on his shoulders until his bones turned to dust. But when his eyes met hers, the exhaustion was eclipsed by a look of such absolute, reverent peace that it made her breath hitch. Because they were finally finished with the war, the bond was a calm, steady hum, a warm hearth fire that promised they would never be cold again. He reached for her, his hand trembling as he tucked a stray hair behind her ear. "It's over," he rasped, his voice thick with a mixture of salt and relief. "The ice is gone, Aelira. I can feel everything." "I know," she replied, leaning into his touch and closing her eyes. "I can feel it too." They stood together in the center of the ruins, two broken things that had found a way to become something entirely new. Since the ritual had been destroyed, the people of the Black Crag began to emerge from the shadows, their eyes searching for the leaders who had promised them freedom. Kael didn't look at the throne. He didn't look at the crown. He looked at the woman who had risked her soul to pull him out of the dark. Because he had finally learned that love wasn't a loss, he stood taller, his hand finding hers and squeezing with a strength that promised a lifetime of protection. Chapter 24. The Claiming of the Dawn. The private solar of the Black Crag was no longer a cold tower. It was filled with the golden amber light of a sunset that promised a new beginning. Aelira stood by the window, watching the pack begin the slow, arduous process of healing. The warriors were training in the courtyard, their shouts sounding like music rather than threats. Because she was no longer a prisoner of her own utility, she felt a sense of peace that was so deep it felt like a physical weight in her chest. She wasn't just safe, she was home. "You're thinking again." Kael's voice rumbled from the doorway, his presence a warm, familiar heat at her back. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his broad chest. He smelled of cedar, ozone, and the fresh, clean air of the peaks. Since the bond had completed, the physical distance between them had become a myth. They moved in a perfect, synchronized dance, their heartbeats a single, powerful drum in the silence of the room. Kael buried his face in the crook of her neck, his breath hot against her skin, his hands wandering over her with a slow, possessive tenderness that made her soul purr. "I was thinking about the wedding," she confessed, her head tilting back to rest on his shoulder. "About how I thought my life was over when he said those words." "He was a fool," Kael whispered, his lips brushing against her pulse point. "He thought he was discarding a tool. He didn't realize he was handing me the sun." He turned her in his arms, his golden eyes searching hers with an intensity that still made her world tilt. He reached out, his thumb tracing the faint, fading scars on her collarbone, the only remnants of the war they had survived. Because they were finally free to choose each other every day, the bond was a beautiful, living thing that grew stronger with every breath they shared. Kael leaned in, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that tasted of safety, desire, and 1,000 years of yes. "This time," she murmured against his lips, her fingers tangling in the dark silk of his hair. I wasn't just needed, I was chosen. You were always the only choice, Aelira, he replied, his voice a low, melodic vow. From the moment I saw you in the shadows, I was yours. I just had to find the courage to deserve you. They stood together on the balcony as the stars began to poke through the velvet sky, the Alpha King and his queen. Not because a council had decreed it, and not because a ritual had forced it. They were there because a rejected bride had dared to believe in a ghost and a hollow man had dared to fight for a heart. As the moon rose over the northern peaks, Aelira smiled, her soul finally at rest. She wasn't a failsafe or a replacement. She was the light that had broken the winter. Epilogue. A year later, the Black Crag was no longer a fortress of iron and ice. It was a beacon of life in the north. Aelira stood on the dais beside Kael, her belly swelling with the promise of the next generation. The pack was thriving, the scars of the war fading into legends told around the fire. Because they had built their kingdom on choice rather than duty, the loyalty of their people was absolute. Kael reached for her hand, his thumb tracing the bond mark on her wrist, his eyes reflecting the silver light of the moon. "Ready?" he asked, his voice a low, loving rumble. "Always," she replied, stepping forward to lead her people into the dawn. Not because she had to, because she wanted to.